Again, thank you and for joining this Wellness Wednesday webinar. My name is Krista Ellis. I'm Community Engagement Manager for the Parkinson's Foundation. And helping me behind the scenes are my colleagues Danielle Agpolo and Laura Cameron. Thank you guys for your support. We are recording today's session, so know that you'll have access to this information following our presentation and the Q&A session afterward. Before we begin the formal webinar, I'd like to share a little bit about the Parkinson's Foundation. The Parkinson's Foundation is a nonprofit focused on bettering the lives of those living with Parkinson's through improving care and advancing research. Importantly, everything we do is in close concert with our community to ensure that our actions are aligned with the needs and priorities of those living with Parkinson's. We are focused on improving care for those living with PD, advancing research towards a cure, and empowering and educating our global community. Today's program is a great example of one of those things we're doing to help us meet these goals. If you're looking to get further involved, we're excited to share our initiative meant to capture the community's perspective on various topics in Parkinson's disease. We hope that you'll join us by signing up for this initiative where we invite you to complete a 10 to 20-minute survey on various topics such as mental health, telehealth, and if you're a care partner. We will always report findings back to the community. You can learn more about getting involved in our surveys at parkinson.org/PF surveys. PD Health at Home is presented by the Light of Day Foundation, whose generosity has made this programming possible. We want to take this moment to thank the Light of Day Foundation for supporting the mission of the Parkinson's Foundation. The Parkinson's Foundation provides weekly educational and wellness programs virtually through our PD Health at Home series, including Mindfulness Mondays, Wellness Wednesdays, which you're currently attending, and Fitness Fridays. As a reminder, all programs are held at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can learn more and register for these programs by visiting parkinson.org/pdhealth. And again, thank you, Light of Day Foundation. This Friday is our live Fitness Friday session. Join me for Functional Fitness with Parkinson Wellness Recovery Power Gym. We're going to bend, twist, push, pull, lift, and step in this functional fitness class for Parkinson's that equips you for the most important type of physical fitness, real life. So it'll be a lot of fun. Join me this Friday. You can register at that website again, parkinson.org/pdhealth. So today we return to our mental wellness series and we explore how to build your PD mental health team. Although Parkinson's disease is known as a movement disorder, for many people living with PD, mood disturbances such as depression, anxiety, and apathy are some of the most troublesome symptoms. Recognizing mood changes and deciding when it's time to seek help are the first steps to building your mental health team. An important part of this process is finding and connecting with the right specialists. Following our conversation, we will have a live Q&A session. So thank you all so much for joining us today and for sticking around for our Q&A session.
Welcome everyone to the Parkinson's Foundation Mental Wellness Series. I'm Jessica Shurer. I'm the Director of Clinical Affairs and Advocacy at CurePSP, which is a nonprofit organization that supports people living with rare atypical Parkinsonism diagnoses. But before I transitioned here in October of 2021, I was the clinical social worker and center coordinator of a Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence for 9.5 years. It is an absolute honor to be part of today's conversation on the very important topic of building your mental health support team. To co-moderate this program, I'm joined by my social work colleague, Lance Wilson. And Lance, please introduce yourself.
My name is Lance Wilson. I am the social worker and Center of Excellence Coordinator for Thomas Jefferson University Hospital's Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorder Center. I've been there, I think, coming up on 5 years. And I primarily work with the Parkinson's disease community, as well as other movement disorders. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Rosemary.
I'm Rosemary Pierce. I live in Chapel Hill, and I've had Parkinson's for probably 5 years. I'm much better as a caregiver. I was a nurse for 50 years. I took care of my husband. So I was pretty slow at getting started on taking care of myself. But I've really learned a lot this year, and I really appreciate the people that I've met.
Hi, I'm Dan Novak. I'm in Fort Worth, Texas. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2008, so I'm going on about 15 years. Prior to that, I spent 31 years at IBM in a variety of roles, and then I served as a professor and a department chair at a university, teaching doctoral classes in leadership. My background is leadership and organizational behavior, and since then I've been volunteering a lot in Parkinson's community, and I'm very active in several different levels, and had a great opportunity of learning at the national level in the Parkinson's Foundation, which really affected my mental health and some of the access that I had to support. So I'm really glad to have that experience with me. So, okay, Jessica.
Before we get started, I did want to make sure that we acknowledge that we recognize that the stories and experiences that our guests share today might not represent everyone living with Parkinson's disease. So some of you viewers out there will be able to relate to aspects that they share of their stories that they share. Some won't. And no matter what, we see you, we're here to support you. We hope that you can take away some helpful information today. And we just commend you on showing up for yourself and being open to learning about this. You both kind of very briefly touched on this in your introductions, but I'd love if you could both maybe briefly tell us a little bit more about your mental health journeys since your Parkinson's diagnosis. Rosemary, I could start with you.
Well, I actually didn't realize I needed someone. And then as I started learning more about Parkinson's, as I met a nurse practitioner who was very helpful. And I started in a support group, and someone mentioned maybe I should have someone. I thought, oh, maybe that's how I'd get the answers, because I have several sisters, but none are on the same road I'm on. I have 4 sons, they're not on the same road. So I figured I don't know anybody with Parkinson's. I've known people who have had it. As a nurse, you learn things like that. So I called many, many people whose names were given to me. And I finally found someone who will listen, who won't push, is very positive, and lives within a half mile of me, so I can walk.
Fantastic.
I was blessed to have access to a large number of people around me who are very competent in their fields. And one of the guys has so many degrees, I don't know what to call him. So I just call him my brain guy. And he actually is an independent counselor and mental health professional. And he was just outstanding. And so informally, I was able to keep in touch with so many people that helped me all along. But a quick story about the start off, it was rough. I asked, when I was found out I was diagnosed, I asked my wife not to talk about it, not to tell people. That was a big mistake, because she spent 2 years not having access to support. And I didn't feel I needed it at that time. I wasn't seeking support. Well, my wife desperately needed to talk about it to somebody, and here I'd asked her to not talk about it. And that was a big mistake. So I would encourage people to not make that same mistake.
And Dan, I think you pull out a really good point, because I think that this is twofold, right? You're experiencing the diagnosis yourself, but also people, a part of your care team, i.e. being your wife, is also going through their own kind of processing that goes along. And I want to also call out, it's great that you had mental health professionals in your social circle, which, I know personally, I try to take off my social work hat when I'm around my friends, but it's impossible. Once you're in it, you're in it. So I'm glad that you were able to have that support.
When you think of having someone in it with you, I said I had 4 sons, and they all have permission to talk to the lady with whom I speak. They have permission to talk, and they have come to several of my doctor appointments, because they all live out of state, with the professionals that I see, so that they are up to date and they do get the help that they need as well. And I agree, that's very important.
Yeah, two big things are jumping out to me, and the themes between you two as you're sharing this. I mean, one is really the power of a team, of recognizing interdependence when it comes to living something like that, like Parkinson's, that you're not alone in whatever way that means. Having your partner, having your children, bringing them into this journey, but also recognizing when it's time to go beyond that into the more professional realm of your support system. And another big thing that both of you kind of touched on is it takes such a different amount of time for every individual with Parkinson's to recognize what those mental health needs are and when they're ready to tap into that kind of team. You know, it took each of you a little bit different to say, like, okay, now this is something that I'm needing right now. So I'd love if we could maybe talk a little bit more about that. And Rosemary, you talked a little bit already about your process of, you know, realizing that you wanted to speak to a therapist, of how you found that person. So could maybe each of you tell us a little bit more about the mental health supports you have tapped into and built that team, even thinking back before your Parkinson's diagnosis, but especially since then?
Well, my husband had Lewy body dementia, and really did not want to go and talk to anybody about it, but I felt we needed to. So I went to a couple of people, but the solution for them was to tell me what they did with their families. Now, I don't want to hear from somebody else. If I'm going to go and see somebody, I decided I need to see someone that will listen to what I have to say and to think of what my problem might be, and just encourage me to discuss it a little further, because this woman that I see helps me to figure out the next step. And for me, that was really important. And I find that a lot of people stand and look and say, oh, you're doing so well, you know, and I think, you know, I have to improve on this, that, and the other thing. And she's the person that I can bounce those things off, and I can learn how to talk to people in a more positive frame of mind.
The key thing to call out is that once you start seeing a professional, they can help you start building strategies. They can kind of be your place where you can be like, I'm a mess, and here are all the reasons why I'm a mess. Even though everybody else might say, you're doing great, you're put together, you're doing a great job. And I think that, you know, we put on that brave front, but all the time that's not how we feel internally. So I'm glad that you came to that realization for yourself.
Yeah, that you found someone who can really meet you where you are.
Exactly.
So as a young person growing up, I thought that I had complete control over my own thoughts and feelings, and that I didn't need outside help. And as life went on, I learned a lot. But especially when I started on my PhD program, I learned that the more I knew, the more I realized how little I know. And that is, the deeper you go, the more you uncover, the deeper it gets. And so I quickly learned as I was going through that to rely on professionals, to rely on expertise. And one of the top things that people look for in a leader is competence.
So could you both maybe share a little bit about like what mental health and mental wellness mean to you, and sort of how you knew anxiety or depression or apathy or not, that this is something I need to address a little bit differently?
Well, when we would go in to diagnose a team, we'd say typically in a team there's a dysfunctional person on the team somewhere, and the team would look around and say, no, not me. And I say, well, then probably is you. Then you're probably the dysfunctional person. So I say the same thing about Parkinson's. People say I don't have any mental health issues or cognitive issues with Parkinson's. I say, well, then you're the person that does. You know, you're just not ready to admit it yet, or you don't know it yet, actually. And I think it's more a matter of they don't know it. I really think that as I look back on my early days, my wife knew it, and I didn't. And I didn't see it as a problem. I didn't see it as a mental health issue. I saw it as overcoming obstacles while taking drugs kind of challenge. And I'm going to take more drugs and go faster and harder, and I'm going to overcome this. And that was not what I needed. What I needed was to slow down and make decisions more, be wise about our decisions, and not appear to be reacting to everything. So the circumstances cause me to react, and that's a sign of mental health issues. If you're out there reacting to every such thing. Now, of course, I have to say, 2008, I graduated with my PhD, got laid off from IBM, was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and then we had the spring 2009 financial crush. So everything crashed around us all at one time. I would say that's pretty good justification for a mental health problem.
That's a lot for you in a very
That is a
short
lot.
period of time. And what I hear you speaking to is coping, which is a part of mental wellness, but it might not be frank anxiety or depression, but it's just trying to, self-reflect and process and make sense of stuff that's going on in your life, with Parkinson's being one aspect of that.
Yeah. I think what helped me, along with the mental health worker, is the fact that I changed my physician, because the physician I had couldn't believe that I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and my next visit it was, boy, he's a smart neurologist. And I thought, whoa, I think I better find somebody else. And I've been very satisfied. And I also found a nurse assistant who helps me as well. And I think that they're the people that said that if I took some antidepressant, it would be a good idea. And I felt much better since I've done that. And they're both the people that encourage me to take different tests and do different things so that I can be as active and continue on with my life. I don't want to give up. And I think that that's when you're mentally well, you don't give up.
And I think you bring up a really good point about meshing well with your provider, right? So I think in this case, you were talking about the neurologist you were seeing at the time, but the same thing with mental health providers. Sometimes you got to shop around.
It's a great example of that team too, because you were talking earlier about your mental health therapist, and now you're talking about how your neurologist is part of that team and your nurse practitioner on that team, all sort of addressing different parts, but complementary parts of your mental wellness. Would you be able to speak a little bit about, how you explain to people the different types of mental health providers and sort of disciplines at play here? Because I always found there could be a lot of confusion around that, psychologist versus psychiatrist versus social worker and all that.
Oh, absolutely. So I think the first thing that I tell people, I am a avid believer that if someone is going to try some type of drug that's been prescribed for mental health, I usually say that I think that you should also seek talk therapy or psychotherapy. And so I really just tease it out for them, and I let them know, well, hey, there are social workers you can speak to, and and I kind of tease out social workers think about the entire person inside of the environment, what other aspects might be playing into your mental health. And then you have psychologists, or like LPCs, therapists, or counselors, which also are doing talk therapy, just same as a clinical social worker. Their perspective is a little bit different in regards to how they acknowledge the person, because psychology really starts with the individual, as opposed to social work, which takes into account the entire atmosphere that the person is in. So I explain that to them. I let them know that, that talk therapy is something that's very advantageous to just have a space. And I think that that's something that we're kind of mentioning here as we listen to Rosemary and Dan's story, that you have space to kind of let that stuff out. And then I also let them know that we're talking about more prescriptions, then we're talking about psychiatry, we're talking about psychiatric nurse practitioners or physician assistants. These are medical providers who are providing medical intervention via medicine. So that those things don't always work immediately. Those things sometimes require titrations. And that's why another reason I tell them, in the meantime, for us to really know if the medicine is working, there's other work that has to be done. So that's usually why I mention possibly doing a talk therapy, or, letting people know that there's online platforms, because sometimes there's some resistance to talk therapy, but not psychopharmacological interventions. So I just do a lot of psychoeducation around who these people are, what they look and how they help, and what would be most appropriate for the individual.
Thank you so much. And I think a really good analogy for that, I've heard a lot in the Parkinson's realm is, Parkinson's, we call it a movement disorder or motor disorder. There is so much focus on the movement symptoms, increasingly on the non-motor symptoms, including this conversation is helping to bring awareness to that. You come into your neurology appointment, you're having difficulty with your walking or a tremor or something like that, and they give you a medication to try to help alleviate some of those symptoms, make them more manageable. And they say we recommend physical therapy or occupational therapy or, exercise as medicine with Parkinson's. So addressing it pharmacologically and non-pharmacologically, therapeutically too. So it's the same thing with mental wellness too. If you're struggling with coping, you're wanting more of those skills, you want to process the experience, or you're having some anxiety or what have you, there are ways to address that pharmacologically, and complementary to that is the therapy to really process it and build those coping skills. And that's what I'm hearing you describe when you talk about the different kinds of disciplines that can help with this.
Yeah, as you were talking about the layers, I'll add real quickly another layer to that, which is executive coaching, the field of coaching, mentoring, organizational behavior. And so that's some of my background. And we have some people out there who are great executive coaching and can go pretty deep. But fortunately, most of us have been trained there's a level at which we cut it off. There's a level at which we do not go below. It's time to hand it off to the clinical side of things and out of the coaching realm.
Would we be able to sort of shift gears a little bit, although it's still along these lines, to talk about some of the barriers or challenges that people can find when trying to address their mental health? And this is, very complicated, very multi-layered, from practical to emotional and everything in between. But wondering what barriers or challenges have come up for the two of you, when thinking about your mental health, when building your support system around it, and how you have overcome those. And maybe Rosemary, we'll start with you.
Well, one of the first things I learned was that if I didn't speak up for myself, no one was going to. Mm-hmm. And that one of the barriers that I found was that I was saying, oh no, that's fine, I don't need that. And I think that I don't know whether it's just women or people who are living there alone, or I don't know, but that really, as far as I can see, would be a barrier. Also, there's no reason that I can't have what I want, what I need, but I've always been a person much better providing for others than I will say I want to sign up for myself, particularly when I'm told it'll be so much for seeing someone at each time, and I can't sort of break myself away, but I'm doing better about that. And I think that then you need someone else to be able to tell you, and I have a financial person who helps me out and says, now Rosemary, and then I listen to him. I think that those are those barriers that came to me, making several phone calls, people didn't call me back. Whoa. And I take my phone with me, and then I'm told, oh, I tried to get you. And I think it's not on my phone. Didn't get clicked off for any reason. So I just have to be positive.
I think that you call out a really good point, because I think the first barrier that any of us experience when trying to say, okay, I'm going to go seek mental health treatment is ourselves, right? The things that we will rationalize and make sense to us and say, I don't need that, especially, in your role, you've been a caretaker, your career is as a caretaker, as a nurse. So I was like, man, I have this handled. So it's so easy to end up in that spiral, and kind of end up in that space. So I definitely hear you when you mention the barriers about actually getting a hold of the people. I think that, and this has been the ongoing theme, COVID has done a number on our mental health clinicians and accessing care. But I'm glad that you had enough fight to keep looking for your person. And Dan, how about you?
I get ignored all the time. It's getting worse with Parkinson's. my voice issues, but anyhow, and now I forgot my second point. I'll think of it in a minute. I already forgot it. So go ahead.
No worries. Well, I think that it's good that you acknowledge that it's not personal, right? This is business. This is still a business at the end of the day, just like your neurology office, just like your mental health provider. There's always sometimes issues to access. Another barrier that I know that I've seen is people will get a list from the insurance company and they're calling like a laundromat or a fast food place. And it's just like, okay, well, now the insurances aren't always dependable with some of the providers. And then sometimes there are crazy wait lists. I mean, like 6 months to a year trying to get in as a new appointment for a mental health provider. And I don't know if Jessica, if you've seen anything else that I didn't mention.
Well, another one that comes to mind for me is a lot of people with Parkinson's over the years and care partners, when they're seeking mental health supports, want someone who is specialized in Parkinson's or at least familiar with Parkinson's. And I get it, right? Especially because in the Parkinson's world, especially in like the PF network, we're always talking about, find a physical therapist or whoever who is specialized in Parkinson's. So we have the same expectations for mental health therapists. They're really hard to come by. That's a huge barrier for folks. So I'm wondering, whoever wants to speak to that, but Lance, and to start with you, like what advice or recommendations do you give to people when they're looking, they're like, okay, I'm ready. There's stigma here. I've addressed that. I realize I need to go forward with this. I have this list of providers. None of them specialize in Parkinson's. How do I find the right person for me?
That is a great question and one I answer often. I usually tell people, look, there's probably going to be a lower probability of us finding someone who specializes in Parkinson's specifically. But what we can look for is someone who specializes in anxiety, someone who specializes in depression, someone who specializes in medical issues or chronic illness, because sometimes that'll be people's claim to fame as a mental health provider. And people who specialize in grief. And that's the biggest one that I get the most pushback about. And people are like, well, I don't know when, I'm not grieving anything. And that becomes a context for a conversation about, loss, ambiguous loss, what that means. And, kind of that transition of, I was able to do X, Y, and Z, and no, I no longer can. That's the type of loss there. So, it allows us to open the door about grieving while still present in it. So once I kind of give people those kind of parameters, it's like, think about it in this way. Let's just take a step back and kind of scope out the problem a little bit. And you might find that you will find a very good mental health professional. I think the biggest concern is people don't want to have to teach about Parkinson's to their provider. But unfortunately, going back to something that Rosemary said, is that you have to sometimes advocate. You have to sometimes make sure that if in order for you to get the best care, you have to sometimes step into a role that you shouldn't have to be in, but would overall enhance your experience.
And at the end of the day, too, I think a lot of, they're supposed to be focused on the person sitting in front of them. So even if they've met 100 other people with Parkinson's, they haven't met you in your experience with Parkinson's and what you're needing to process and address in therapy. And so that's ultimately, that's another way to advocate for yourself, is like, here's what I want us to talk about together, even though it's helpful to have some knowledge on Parkinson's. So I want to be mindful of our time, and we are going to wrap up soon, but I just want to turn to Dan and Rosemary one more time and just, what advice would you offer other people living with Parkinson's regarding mental health and mental wellness as you reflect back on your own journey with it?
Go ahead, Rosemary.
And realize one day is not going to be like the next, though probably never was. And once you find someone, you're diagnosed, you can admit to the fact that you do have this disease, and you can start taking care of yourself. And I think the sooner we do that, each of us does that, the better we'll be, and that we'll be able to continue.
Mental health is such a prevalent issue for all of us. And when I meet a new person in one of my groups and they walk in the door, I say, sorry to meet you under these circumstances. It's glad to meet you. And how long ago were you diagnosed? Because that helps me learn a lot about where the person's at in their journey. Second of all, do you still have kids at home? Do you have family at home? Because that tells me a whole lot about the journey they're on and what their priorities are, what their values are at that point. But then the third thing I ask them is, what have you been doing since your diagnosis? And I'm trying to find out if they've been in grief. We're all going through some level of grief. I'm not admitting or not. Find out if they've been sitting on the couch or if they've been exercising and doing things.
Thank you both so much. Lance, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. I think we had a really great conversation here today. I want to personally thank Rosemary and Dan for sharing their stories, because this is one of the biggest ways and one of the greatest ways that people build connection and relationship with one another, hearing the testimonies of people who were in it, right? I want to thank my lovely co-facilitator, Jessica, and we thank you for joining us today to have this conversation about building your mental health team.
Great. Lance, Jessica, Dan, Rosemary, if you guys would join me on camera with your mics open for conversation.
Hi.
Hi. I'm waiting for Rosemary to join us. Thank you guys so much for sharing your experiences in living with Parkinson's disease, working with Parkinson's disease. Hi, Rosemary. There you are.
I am.
We have a lot of questions that have came in from our viewers, and I just want to thank everyone for feeling safe enough to ask these questions. I want to begin first by asking Jessica and Lance a very, tender question. I'm seeing a big change in the generations of Parkinson's disease. So we're thinking about different age populations. And as we get more refined in diagnosing Parkinson's disease, we're seeing more diagnosis of Parkinson's disease at a younger age. And there's a clear difference in the communities talking about mental health. And we know in older generations that talking about mental health has quite a stigma to it. We don't talk about it. We don't like to talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. Would you, Jessica and Lance, just address a little bit about the stigma of mental health and kind of the trajectory of change for that?
Sure. I guess I'll go first. So I think that you bring up a good point in regards to the age shift, right? So there are people who, what happens in my house stays in my house. And, I handle it because this idea that needing someone, especially on the mental health level, shows some kind of issue with me. There's something wrong with me. And I think what we're seeing now with this group of younger people who are being diagnosed is there's a culture shift that mental health, is meant to be both preventative and address crisis. And I think that a lot of people get to mental health services too late because they're in crisis. And I think the shift we're seeing is that people are having mental health providers as preventative medicine, like going to your doctor once a year for your checkup. So I think that that's a shift that I'm seeing specifically as that trends.
I think it's a great point. And I think I don't think we can have a conversation about mental health without recognizing there is a stigma around, reflecting on your own mental health, on addressing your mental health, on talking about mental health. I think a lot about this around vulnerability. And for a very long time, and still now to a great extent, but there's a really good dialogue going on around it, there's been this perception that if I am vulnerable, if I have any kind of mental or physical or cognitive challenges, it means that I'm less than, that I'm weak. And I've seen this shift in more recent years, and largely thanks to Brene Brown, honestly. She's a social work researcher who's done a lot of work around shame and vulnerability and has written books on it. But there's a shift into recognizing how there is courage through vulnerability in saying, you know what, I am human and I have these human needs, and to normalize that and validate that for yourself. And I think having that more of a national, international conversation and having that shift in younger generations is certainly helping, all generations and all populations. And another thought I have with that too, for as challenging as COVID was in so many levels, and we won't delve into that, I think silver lining of COVID is that it's really helped to shift that to help create awareness around mental health and wellness and addressing that and recognizing your own needs in that. I spent 9 years in this field of trying to get people with Parkinson's who were telling me they were having difficulty with coping and mood, trying to get them to go to mental health therapy, and to COVID hitting, and all of a sudden so many people were ready. They were like, I get it now. I need to talk about this and process this. And then all of a sudden, a lot of mental health providers started not having, availability to take on new clients anymore because of that. And that's sort of where we're at now. So I think that's a positive thing in that regard. And I'd love to hear from Dan and Rosemary about that. Like, have you experienced mental health stigma, and how have you coped with that?
I can't say that I have.
Okay.
Maybe I just haven't listened to people, but most people are encouraging me. I know my family encourages me, and I have a sister that doesn't live far, and actually she lives around a big corner. And she's very, just when I speak to her about the Parkinson's and what I'm doing, she's very encouraging. And I appreciate that. But I think you need to be close to the person that you're mentioning these things to, because I don't think everybody's at the same point in their life as I am. I know there aren't that many, but I think if you speak positively, it really helps.
Having people who support you through that. Go ahead, Dan.
One brief example is I used to ride a bike pretty well, and I had a recumbent bike that was fast. I wasn't fast, but the bike was really fast. And so I could get out there and ride with the fairly good riders. And they were surprised, but they would come up beside me and say, why are you cheating? Why are you riding that recumbent bike? I said, well, I have Parkinson's disease. And finally, one guy calmly waited a couple minutes and he said, you're doing pretty good. And that was just a difference in his mind shift from you're cheating to, oh, you have Parkinson's disease and you're out here riding with the rest of us. And I should be encouraging you instead of putting you down. I used to run into it at work a lot. And I just brought up the emails between me and Social Security Administration about filing for disability. And it was pretty wild. I went through years of that before I got approved. But the evaluator that I was assigned to was literally senile. And I wrote a letter to him saying, this guy doesn't have a clue. He should not be evaluating people with more than high school education. He looked at me and said, you're not going to qualify, and you shouldn't be out there taking money away from people that need it worse than you do. So just some, he really thought I was, not qualified to do anything. He thought I was being cheating. Yet at the same time, I was managing, 150 professors in a business school, and I couldn't remember the program that we had done the day before, that we had approved the day before. So I was tough for me to keep up with that, but that's different than writing an email. I could write a long email saying, you got to fire this guy. If I have a month to do it and no interruptions, I could get it done in a month. But to make decisions on the fly every day just doesn't work. So.
Well, something I hear in that is the importance of awareness. So, educating people about Parkinson's disease and what that lived experience is for you. And that normalizes it for people and humanizes it for people. And there's so it decreases stigma around Parkinson's, but then there's also decreasing stigma around mental health when you create awareness around that.
Yeah, thank you. That was the point I was supposed to be making.
You did make it.
Was that when I first heard a psychic evaluator, 2013, I was getting ready for my first DBS operation, and he said, "You have mild cognitive impairment." I said, "No, not me." I mean, I couldn't imagine that I had mild cognitive impairment because I still had a relatively photographic memory. I can still remember a lot of things, but I started losing that. But anyhow, so now 10 years later, I'm like, oh yeah, I was impaired big time. I mean, I can't remember squat from back then. And so just the change in my attitude, change in my recognition has changed a lot. And now I have to talk about it. I have to tell people because otherwise they're looking at me funny. And so I just go ahead and tell them I have Parkinson's, and that changes everything.
It takes a lot of self-awareness too, is what I'm hearing in that.
Yeah.
And that comes with time sometimes.
Thank you, Dan, for sharing. Another question that we kind of circled around was about online services. So we have a few viewers who are asking about connecting with a mental health provider, counselor, therapy options in rural areas, and wondering, one, how we find mental professionals in our area, but also if online services are as impactful as meeting with a therapist in person.
I can start, Jess.
I was going to suggest you do.
So, and shout out to the rural community because there's a lot of resources that they do not have access to that the big cities and the suburbs do. So I think if you are thinking about using an online service, there are a few that are out there. And a lot of, especially in COVID, a lot of mental health professionals have transitioned online. And I think that there's a few things that you should think about. So I'm not going to say that the impact is the same as meeting someone in person. There are certain things that that person, as a trained mental health professional, cannot assess from you because you were on the screen. So body language is a very big way of how us as mental health providers are able to tune into what individuals need from us, and allows us to pivot as necessary. So there are pieces that are going to be very specific to talk therapy, and what you express is going to be what the therapist or the mental health professional is responding to. So when I say that, the difference for in person, there's also a lot of things that don't have to be explained. Usually, and if you're doing teletherapy, you are in your own environment, which can also offer insight to the therapist they would not get if you went to their office. So you're getting some and you're losing some. But really the main thing is that I would say that teletherapy is still an accessible resource, and a lot of people are able to transition from online to in person if they feel as though, or you ask if that is an option for them.
Thanks, Lance. Always love to bring light to the options that are available in any environment that we may be living in. Dan, I'd like to ask you a question. We've actually had multiple viewers kind of curtail around the same subject, and it's around their husbands or their fathers living with Parkinson's who don't want to talk about the impact that they're having mentally. They don't want to talk about interventions. They don't want to talk about their feelings, what's happening cognitively. Would you just perhaps, talk about how you got started in recognizing your potential need for more support, seeking talk therapy or otherwise kind of other resources that you might have?
As I mentioned in the earlier recording, I grew up thinking I could never need support, and I don't need somebody to talk to. And actually years later in my leadership studies, I used to tell a story in classes, and everything has to come with a grain of salt, right? No theory, no statement can be accurate and simple and applicable to everybody. So these are generalizations, they're called. Cannot be simple and accurate and applies to everybody. So guess what? There's differences between men and women. You know, it may be simple, but not accurate and doesn't apply to everybody. Anyhow, when you ask a woman how she feels, she tells you. When you ask a man how he feels, he says, "I don't," and that's true. He doesn't feel on a lot of subjects. So I didn't feel a need early on to need counseling and coaching and people around me when I was diagnosed. And as I said in the earlier video, I told my wife I'd rather not talk about it with other people, and I cut her out of the opportunity to have the support that she needed, and that was a wrong thing to do by far. So if you'll remind me of the original question again, just briefly.
When you realized that you were at a point where you needed
Oh.
some extra support or guidance in seeking,
Yes. Well, when my wife said, when a movement disorder specialist said, "Dan, do you want to save your marriage or not?" That's when I realized that I needed to do something for sure. And my wife asked me the same thing, and of course I do it for her. But it's easy to push back and say, "I don't need that stuff," but I'm cutting them out of opportunity. So if you have a father who says, "I don't need that stuff," tell him that he's robbing you of the opportunity to get the help you need. It's not about him needing the help, but you need the help, and you can only do that with his cooperation and his help, his participation in that. So they've got to, you have to force them into doing that, and frankly, it takes sometimes, and once again, it's a generalization. Forgive me. My wife sought out 2 or 3 men in our lives that she thought she could ask to intervene on her behalf, and unfortunately, in this case, none of them did. So she went to 3 close people. So I even though it didn't work for us, I suggest that for other people. Go to somebody who can talk to this man in your life and say, I need your help. I need you to do something about this now. So.
You know, Dan, if I may comment on this, it's interesting. I heard you say, you know, I know that you recognize generalizations, and I think, you know, I appreciate that you did that. But I heard you say men don't feel, and that's true. But in our short time of knowing one another and, you know, having spoken with one another over the last several months, I hear you feel a lot. You've shared a lot of that with us.
I didn't tell the complete story. If you ask a man how he feels about certain topics, he may say he doesn't care, right? He doesn't feel. So my wife asked me about new furniture. I say, I don't feel. I don't have that, you know? So yes, you're correct. My generalization was not very general.
But I think it's a really good point. I think that we have to recognize sort of the intersections of all these different identities that we carry, you know, as a person with Parkinson's, and your professional life and your gender identity, and, you know, name anything else, religious beliefs and race and ethnicity and all of that intersects to help shape the lens through which you are, you know, viewing and experiencing Parkinson's disease, and gender is an important part of that. And if, you know, gender for you means I experience or feel things or communicate in certain ways, process in certain ways, and that's going to, you know, shape how your mental health and how you think about that and talk about that. And it's a great example of how that can evolve over time too, as has been the case for you.
Yeah. If you take my parents, myself, and my kids, all 3 partnerships, if you will, violate my generalization. So my dad is the sensitive one, I'm the sensitive one, and my daughter is the sensitive one. Or no, sorry, my son is the sensitive one. Between him and his sister. So yes, we all break that rule.
And I think that another thing that Jessica had kind of leaned into is that there's this historical context that goes into why men don't feel, right? So I think that as we move into these newer times, quote unquote, there's this idea of unraveling that history, because there's a traumatic history that comes along with what men needed to be historically, or what men had to represent historically. And so this idea of men don't feel is a shell that was created by the times. And so when you're getting to this place of men don't feel, there's this almost progression as you go through life that you have to unlearn the things that once were coping strategies for you, or things that once made sense for, I had to do this in order to survive this issue, but that issue is no longer a threat to you. So how do I transition from this responsive thing that I used to do that is no longer serving me, and get to a place where I can be as Jessica said, more vulnerable, and understanding that vulnerability is not a negative. And it actually unlocks the door for so many other things that you wouldn't have access to because you appeared as hard as opposed to being gentle and allowing yourself to feel things that you wouldn't have felt regardless of that.
Mhm.
Jessica for sharing, and Dan, of course, for being vulnerable. Rosemary, I'd love to bring some spotlight to you. We got a very specific question in the interview, the discussion we had earlier. You had mentioned changing your doctor, and one viewer is asking why. Why did you change your doctor? What kind of prompted you to shift to another professional, another individual for the support that you needed?
This was not my neurologist. My neurologist he's the one that diagnosed me. He's really very sharp person and quite caring. And I see his nurse practitioner quite often now. I changed my doctor because I didn't feel he was. Parkinson's is my most, not only annoying, I shouldn't say annoying, but the illness that I have that I need to work on, the one that I need to assess so that I know whether or not I need to go and have physical therapy again, or I need to change my medication. I do have arthritis also, but I felt when I heard that one of the doctors in the practice had several patients with Parkinson's, then I thought maybe she could work together with the neurology group. And that's worked quite well. It's been almost a year now. And they can talk to each other. They can, they seem to work very well. And therefore I was and am quite pleased. So, I mean, I think it's hard to find exactly what you need, what you want. I think with a mental health expert, you may go to one or two or three practitioners before you find the one that you can converse with at the time. And I think that each of us has needs that change, and maybe one day we'll wake up and we'll think, wait a minute, I'm not discussing this, that, or the other thing, and this is what I need to discuss. And if the person you're talking with is not able to do that, then again, if you can change, perhaps that's the right thing to do.
Thank you for sharing that, Rosemary, because I think it gives a lot of context to individuals as they navigate Parkinson's, and Parkinson's can be annoying. So I don't think that you're wrong for saying that it is. And it can be living with it. So I think that one thing that I want to bring that Rosemary mentioned, bring up or raise is this idea that you drive your care. So if there is something that is not making sense, or it might be personality, it might be the doctor might specialize in X, Y, and Z, but Parkinson's might be new to them. You drive that vehicle for making sure that, going back to what we talked about in our talk, advocating for yourself. If there's something that's missing from you getting the most optimized care possible, you have the ability to get second, third, fourth opinions. You have the ability to say, hey, this is what this one doc said. What do you think? So I just want to raise that up, because people sometimes feel pigeonholed into, you go to one provider, you have to stay with that provider. There's a shopping around sometimes that happens. And this is not only with neurologists, this is specifically with mental health providers. You might realize for some people, who do you feel most comfortable talking to? Some people will say, I know for me, in my mental health journey, I feel most comfortable talking to women. That's just something but people have to explore those parts of themselves to know, hey, is this something I feel comfortable talking to this demographic about? Because sometimes if not, you might be surprised if it's someone else, or you might feel surprised in regards to who you end up with by just shopping around.
Building your PD mental health, but comprehensive healthcare team takes time, takes persistence, takes shopping, as you called it, Lance. And Rosemary, you alluded to the fact that there, you discovered this person and made the initiative to connect with them because you were aware of the needs that you needed weren't being met just by the general neurologist himself, but knew that you also needed additional support. So pat on your back for recognizing that and taking the initiative to build your care team.
The kind of trust that we need with our doctors requires both competence-based trust and listening-based trust, or affect-based trust, where they actually listen to us. And unfortunately, I've been through several doctors. Sometimes it was a joint agreement, sometimes it was mine, sometimes it was theirs. It says we don't have a trusting relationship based on competence and listening. You teach the doctor should listen. I even quoted back to this doctor that this doctor told me that the doctor should listen, and the doctor wasn't listening. And she finally said, "Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. Go." So.
Thank you, Dan. Jessica, Rosemary, any final remarks before we close out today's webinar?
Rosemary, you want to go first?
I'm just grateful to have been a participant. I think I thought a lot, I learned a lot. And as I have on this whole journey for Parkinson's, I hope that the people that have Parkinson's who are listening will think about what they've heard and see if there's something they need to do to help themselves a little bit. I know when I took care of my husband, he had dementia very quickly, and so that I was the one making all the decisions. And that was very different than it is now, because I could stand back and see whether or not it was a good decision. Now I have to feel it's a good decision, and that's a little different.
Those are great points, Rosemary. Thank you. And I just want to end my thoughts by saying, like Dan and Rosemary, I learned so much from you through our conversations today and when we recorded our conversation last month. And, there's so much I think the people watching today can take away from that, and what you shared will resonate with them. And I would just, for all those watching, first of all, commend yourself for showing up today, because that being even open to this topic and learning about it and reflecting on it is a huge step. And I would also walk away from this reflecting on, what does this mean for you? How do you define mental health and wellness in your life? How are you addressing it? What needs and goals do you have around that? And something that I definitely learned from Dan and Rosemary that I want to emphasize is, whether you're a care partner or a person living with Parkinson's, empower yourself and be confident in that you are your own best advocate and expert in your experience with this diagnosis. And to, just to feel confident in that and share that with others. And I'm not wrapping up on saying words that make sense, but it's been a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So thank you, Parkinson's Foundation, for putting it on, and for the three of you, and for Krista for facilitating this.
If I can make 2 comments.
Sure, Dan.
Number one is that when I started on this journey 15 years ago, I thought this tremor thing's not so bad. It turns out I don't even have tremor. So now I recognize that all these other symptoms are much more important in the long run. So be open to the fact that your values are going to change. What's important to you now in terms of tremor and walk and stuff like that may be drastically different for you later on. And just be ready for that and open for that, and keep assessing what's important. Most important point I want to leave us with, though, is this: it affects our caregivers also. We need support for our caregivers. So I'll let y'all take that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. On behalf of all of us at the Parkinson's Foundation, many thanks to our panelists, Jessica, Lance, Dan, and Rosemary, and many thanks to all of you who joined us today. If you had a question that was not answered, please don't hesitate to reach out to our helpline Our helpline can also get you connected to mental health resources. That number is 1-800-4PD-INFO. Please know again that today our event was recorded. You will receive a follow-up email next week with the recording link and resources for you to access as well. Our next Wellness Wednesday will be returning to our palliative care series and addressing the things to know about hospice care for people with Parkinson's. During this session, we will introduce hospice, explore what hospice is, the types of services hospice provides, and the typical timing of hospice care. We'll also discuss how to select a hospice program that will best fit your needs and how to be an advocate to receive the types of services you need. I think it's clear that the Parkinson's Foundation is addressing these difficult and more challenging conversations to be had in living with Parkinson's disease. I applaud you all in taking the time to explore and think about these hard and perhaps heavy topics that might be embracing in your life's journey with Parkinson's. Again, our helpline is here for you. You can explore our extensive website at parkinson.org. You can email our helpline at helpline@parkinson.org. Until I see you all again soon on our next Zoom call, bye for now.